What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. This time we're going to be going over the healer. Now much like our tanking guide, this is going to be split up into three parts. This first part is going to be just covering gear. The second part is going to be covering over non-gear related things such as attribute points, skill bars, Munda Stone, CP distribution, those sort of things. And part 3 is going to be a demonstration of how I heal on my healer. Just so you guys can get an idea of how the healer plays in ESO, because it's not simply just about healing, it's also about buffing your allies and debuffing your enemies, so you can kind of get a sense of how I go about doing that, what I prioritize, things like that in part 3. Part 1 of this video is all about the gear, and so gear is pretty much universal across all classes of healers, regardless of whether you're a Templar, a Warden, Nightblade, Dragon Knight, any healer. You're always going to be using these particular sets. Some sets are obviously going to be more effective on certain classes, and I'll be covering that here in this first part of our guide here. But for the most part, these are going to be your selection of sets to choose from as a healer. Do keep in mind that a lot of these sets are gated behind DLC content or chapters, so if you intend on going into endgame content, you want to heal vet trials, you want to be as effective as you can as a healer, you're going to need to get ESO Plus, or you're going to need to purchase the DLC or chapters in order to get access to these sets. So that is something to keep in mind. If you don't intend on doing vet trials or anything like that, you don't necessarily need to get ESO Plus to become a good healer, but for the endgame content you will need access to the DLCs. So starting things off here, first we're just going to quickly go over the preferred traits for each piece, as well as jewelry and weapons. For your large pieces, which are going to be your helm, chest, and legs, you want it infused with prismatic enchants. And for your small pieces, which are going to be your shoulders, hands, waist, and feet, you want divines with max magicka enchants. Now for jewelry, you can go a combination of spell damage and regen. You don't want all three to be spell damage, and you don't want all three to be magicka regen. Just like most things in life, if you invest too heavily in one thing, you're going to end up sacrificing in other areas. So if you put all three glyphs as magicka regen, your spell damage is going to suffer, which means you're going to have weaker heals overall. Likewise, if you put all your glyphs as spell damage, you're going to have lower regen, which means in longer and more intensive fights, you're going to be suffering in terms of resource pool. So try to find that balance. I personally like 2 spell damage and 1 regen glyph, but it's really up to you how you want to play around with that. For your healer, for your restoration staff, you have a couple options for traits. You can have infused, powered is also a good choice. You can go with defending if you're feeling a little bit squishy, and you can also do precise for some added crit chance to get those crit heals going. For your back bar, which is going to be your lightning staff, you have again some options. You can go with infused or powered. Those are the top 2 choices. Beyond that, you can also stick with defending if you're still feeling a little bit squishy, but that's pretty much it for lightning staves. Infused, powered, and defending are going to be your top 3 choices. Precise is somewhat helpful, but it's not nearly as good as those other top 3 choices. So with that out of the way, we're going to start going over our gear sets. Now there's one gear set in particular that you're always going to want to have, and that's going to be Spell Power Cure. You can get this from White Gold Tower as a dungeon. It's the light armor set that's dropped there. So you always want this as your armor piece, because of the 5-piece effect scales with the quality of the item. So you want it to be legendary quality. The Spell Power Cure does not drop in gold jewelry. As far as we know, the vendor does not sell any Spell Power Cure jewelry. We don't know if that's going to change, because they did make a couple of changes to how the golden vendor works. But for right now, we can assume that there aren't going to be any gold Spell Power Cure jewelries coming out in the near to middle tier future. So you're going to want to stick with armor pieces for your Spell Power Cure. You can get the purple jewelries while you're farming gears, just so you have some flexibility in terms of picking and choosing which gear sets. But ultimately, you're going to want to have gold Spell Power Cure, Armor. So why do we want Spell Power Cure? The 5-piece effect, when you heal a friendly target at full health, you have 50% chance to increase their weapon and spell damage by 258 for 10 seconds. This is a huge, huge buff. To put that into perspective, for your average magicka DPS, this is going to be between an 8 to 10% increase to their spell damage. And for the average stamina DPS, this is going to be about a 5% increase to their weapon damage, between 5 to 6%. That is a very, very big boost to DPS. So that's why Spell Power Cure is just so powerful, and it's pretty much a must-have for endgame content. If you don't have Spell Power Cure, a lot of guilds, not all of them, but a lot of guilds are going to turn you away as a healer, because this is just such a powerful buffing set. So if you do want to do vet endgame content, you must farm Spell Power Cure. You must have it. So beyond that, the next couple of your second 5-piece set is going to be dependent on your group composition, whether you're doing 4-man content or a trial for 12-man content, as well as what your other healer is wearing in your trial group, and finally, kind of what does your raid leader want. So you have two main sets, alternative sets for your second 5-piece set. This is going to be the first one, and it's going to be a Worm Cult. It reduces the cost of your magicka abilities by 4% for you and up to 11 other group members within 28 meters of you. This does not scale with item quality. It's always going to be a 4% reduction, regardless of the quality of the armor. Or this is why you kind of want jewelry pieces to be Worm Cult, because that for 5-piece is not affected by item quality. So Worm Cult is very powerful, especially in trials content. You and the healer obviously both use magicka. Tanks typically use magicka for their buffing abilities, so they're gonna enjoy that extra reduction in their cost of those abilities. And you're always typically gonna have between 2 to 3 magicka DPS in a trials group minimum. That's just so they can apply Lightning Wall to increase off-balance uptime for their stamina DPS. Where you are not going to find Worm Cult being used is in 4-man content, where you have 2 stamina DPS. In that case, you just have a tank and a healer. So the benefit of Worm Cult kind of falls flat, because your stamina DPS aren't getting the benefit of that Worm Cult, because they're obviously not using many magic abilities, if they're using any magic abilities at all. So that's kind of where you're going to want to swap out Worm Cult for a different set. For your other second 5-piece, you have a couple of options here. This is the first one, Twilight Remedy. It gives you magicka regen, minor Aegis, which always helps out for your survivability, spell damage, and then the 5-piece effect, whenever your ally activates a synergy, they get healed for X amount of health over 10 seconds and gain minor force for the same amount of time. This can occur once every 10 seconds per ally. Now, Twilight Remedy used to be a very powerful set, back when orbs and shards did not share synergy, so you could pop an orb and activate a shard right afterwards. But ever since Morrowind, Twilight Remedy has definitely gone down in utility, because orbs and shards do share a synergy now, which basically means you can only really provide 2 or 3 synergies at a time. So if you're only getting orbs and shards, then you're only really getting a 50% uptime on Twilight Remedy due to the cooldown on orbs and shards. Now if you're having stuff like Extended Ritual with the Purify synergy, you can up that up a little bit more. So it's not quite as useful as it once was. I still like it because there's not many sources of minor force for magicka DPS, but outside of Stalwart Guard, which has its own drawbacks. But Twilight Remedy itself is definitely not a must-have set. It's kind of a nice-to-have set that you can sometimes use, but there are other sets that you can use that are going to provide better utility. Twilight Remedy might make a comeback later on, so it's definitely something you want to hold on to, but it's not going to be a set that you're going to find very often in trials groups. Another set that you can use as your second 5-piece along with Spell Power Cure is going to be Master Architect. Gives you max magicka, minor slayer spell damage, and a 5-piece effect. When you use an ultimate ability, you and the closest 2 allies to you within 28 meters gain major slayer for 10 seconds. This is not as useful for Templar healers because you have to use an ultimate ability. So Your cheapest ultimate for a Templar healer is basically going to be Crescent Sweep, which you're not really going to be using because that's more of a DBS ultimate. If you want to use a healing ultimate, Templar healing ultimate, let me just pop to it real quick. Restoring Light, Practice Incantation or Remembrance, that's going to be your cheapest one at 120, and that's still a fairly expensive ultimate to use, so you're not going to have very high uptime on a Templar. Where Master Architect shines is with Warden Healers. Warden Healers have an ultimate called Healing Thicket under their green balance tree that costs, I believe they've upped it to 80 ultimate, so that's a very cheap ultimate to use. It has a morph that returns 20 ultimate whenever you heal anybody that's below 50% health. It is only a 20 ultimate gain, but it basically cuts the amount of ultimate you have to build up by basically 25%. So that's kind of where Master Architect shines. That's when you have a Warden Healer using that Healing Thicket ultimate. The downside is it only affects 2 closest allies to you, so you kind of have to be situationally aware of where the DPS are standing in relation to you, because you don't want this Major Slayer to be placed on the other healer or the tank, because they're not really gonna see as much benefit as the DPS. Now, Master Architect is not as great in Trials Group as it is in 4-man content, obviously because you have 8 to 9 DPS, so obviously not everybody's getting that Major Slayer bonus. Warhorn in many instances is going to be more beneficial to the group, Aggressive Warhorn versus Master Architect, but in 4-man content where you have Tank Healer 2 DPS, or even just a Heal Tank and 3 DPS, that's where Master Architect really shines, because all you have to do is make sure you're next to the 2 DPS and they get Major Slayer for 10 seconds, so it's very powerful. It sees the best use out of a Warden healer, not so much as a Templar or any other class really. So Mending Healing Mage is going to be the second most popular set that you see as healers, especially in Trials groups. Gives you magicka regen, max magicka, and healing done. The 5-piece effect, when you use an area of effect heal ability, you reduce the weapon damage of all enemies within 10 meters of you by X amount for 3 seconds. The 5-piece does scale with item quality. However, unlike Spell Power Cure, you can get gold mending jewelry. You just have to do Vet Ethereal Archive in order to get that jewelry. So mending is very powerful due to that 5-piece effect, reducing the weapon damage of all of your enemies. Area of effect heals. A lot of things count as area of effect heals. We'll quickly just, let me just, where is healing mage? I'm just going to quickly put on a full 5-piece set for you guys, so you guys can get a sense of what abilities count as area of effect healing. So the debuff does count as a debuff on the enemy, so it will pull enemies into combat for you. So do keep that in mind before you wear it and use an area of effect heal. So obviously Extended Ritual counts. You see there, Healing Bane was applied to the target skeleton. Healing Springs counts, obviously. Combat Prayer counts, you can see there Combat Prayer counted. Orbs count. Energy Orbs does count as an area of effect heal. Let's see what other healing abilities we have. In combat. So you can see here I am in combat because it did apply debuff to the enemy. Something to keep in mind. Let's do this. Breath of Life counts as an area of effect heal. Mutagen counts as an area of effect heal. I'm not sure if Healing Ward counts. Let's go ahead and try it out. Healing Ward does not proc mending. Now let's try out the healing ultimates. Healing ultimates should all count as area of effect heals. Oh yes, one thing that I forgot to mention you're using Master Architect. For your traits, you can then use Decisive. Those is a possible trait you can use now as a healer if you are using Master Architect. If you're not using Master Architect, Decisive is not necessarily going to be as useful for you. Alright, so let's see if Panacea counts as a... Yep, that counts as an area of effect heal. So now there's one more ultimate that we have to try. That is the Templar healing ulti. I can tell you right now from experimentation that pretty much all of the Warden's heals do count as area of effect heals. Their green balance abilities, all of them count as area of effect heals except for the Vine move. The Vine move does not count. You can see here the Templar healing ulti also counts as an area of effect heal. Unfortunately, it only counts the first cast, so every subsequent healing cast does not actually proc mending. Alright, so enough with the testing for mending. So why do we care that what affects mending? You can see a lot of healing abilities that you use do proc mending, and that decreases the weapon damage of all enemies within 10 meters of you. From my personal testing, we have found that that reduction results in about a 10 to 15% decrease in the amount of damage that a mob will put out. How much specifically depends on the boss, but that's kind of what you can expect from mending. A 10% reduction in damage, incoming damage, is a very, very powerful effect. That's where mending really, really shines. The downside of mending is that you need to be within 10 meters of an enemy. 10 meters is actually not that big of a distance. If you look at Healing Springs, it has a radius of 8 meters. So you can see here, that's 8 meters. So if we are all the way over here, we aren't able to hit him because it's not within 8 meters. Still not hitting him. Now we are hitting the target dummy. So around here, this is how far you need to be from the boss in order for mending to work. That is the one downside of mending. You have to be fairly close to the boss. That being said though, that weapon damage reduction is still very powerful, and that's why mending is a very popular choice for Trials healers. Now, beyond mending, this is another set that we can use. It's Sanctuary. Max health, healing taken, and max magicka, so the 2 to 4 piece bonuses for Sanctuary aren't nearly as good as the other sets that we just covered. But the 5 piece increases your healing received by 12% for you and up to 11 members within 10 meters of you. Again, this is limited due to the proximity. Basically, people need to be within 10 meters of you, more or less within your Healing Springs radius. But the other thing that makes Sanctuary not as great in practice is that it doesn't prevent one-shots. If you take a look, remember mending reduces the amount of damage that is coming in. So since it reduces damage, it can take a one-shot ability and turn it into a survivable hit. Unlike Sanctuary, it doesn't reduce the incoming damage, so a one-shot is still going to be a one-shot. That's the real strength behind mending. And none of these other sets, even Spellpower Cure, Twilight Remedy, Master Architect, they never decrease incoming damage. Mending does. And so decreasing that incoming damage is very, very powerful. And this decrease is taken before things like block reduction and damage mitigation from resistances, passive, things like that. So it ends up being a very, very powerful set because it decreases the initial hit by a significant portion, making one-shots a lot more survivable now. You can now take a hit that would normally kill you. Sanctuary, it increases the amount of healing that other people receive around you, but it is limited because they have to be within 10 meters of you, and it doesn't prevent one-shots. It does increase the healing potency, but at the same time, it's easy to overheal using Sanctuary, and overhealing is basically wasting magicka. The concept of overhealing is basically you're healing your allies for more than they are capable of receiving. And it's very, very easy to overheal with Sanctuary, so that's kind of why Sanctuary is a set that you can hold on to for healers. It's a good training set, so to speak, for healing, but it is not something that you'll find many Trials guilds running. Progression guilds may elect to use Sanctuary in order to help the groups out for healing, to staying alive, but overall Mending will provide a better survivability to the group compared to Sanctuary. Now there are a couple of those sets that I just covered are pretty much universal across all classes. Worm Cult, Twilight Remedy, Master Architect, Mending, and Sanctuary, those can be pretty much be used across the board. Now there are a couple of, there is one gear set in particular that is specific to the Dragon Knight healer. Let me see if I can find where the box is. It is an overland set, so you can purchase it off guild traders. Light dungeon. Okay, let's see. This. And it is. Let's see here. Not that. Not that. Here it is. Trinamax Valor. I'll take out a piece here so you can see what the effect is. Magic regen, max magicka regen. 5-piece effect: when you cast a damage shield on an ally, you have a 20% chance to call down a fragment of Trinamax that heals you and your allies for X health and deals damages enemies for X amount of magic damage in a 5-meter radius. This effect can occur once every 5 seconds. This is specific for Dragon Knight healers because Dragon Knight healers tend to use more damage shield abilities. They will use Healing Ward and they will use Igneous Shields to shield your ally. So for every ally that you hit with Igneous Shield, it has a chance of proccing Trinamax Valor. So if you are a Dragon Knight healer, Trinamax Valor is a potential second 5-piece set that you can use. But if you are a Templar or Warden healer, don't even bother with Trinamax Valor because you don't really have a damage shield ability. The only damage shield ability that you'll really be using is going to be Healing Ward and the Ultimate Barrier, but that's not really going to be in your repertoire. It's not going to be in your skill set. Even for endgame content or for 4-man trials, it's just not something that you're going to be really using. So again, Trinamax Valor, Dragon Knight healers, good set, and everybody else, bad set. And that's basically it for healing sets. You have a couple of other sets that you could use, but they're just not really of note. For example, Herseens, which increases stamina regen, not all that useful. There are a couple of other sets like Light Speakers that seem good on paper. Light Speakers increases the spell damage of your Restoration Staff abilities, but it's still not as useful as Mending or Worm Cult, which provides a lot more group benefit compared to things like just adding spell damage to your Restoration Staff abilities. You don't need to overheal. Healing in this game is actually not that hard. It's not hard to keep your allies up their health up. So you're going to be spending a lot more time buffing your allies and debuffing the enemies. So those are the kind of sets you're going to want to see on a healer. Sets that debuff the enemy, like Mending, or sets that buff your allies, like Spell Power Cure or Worm Cult. So now for weapons specifically. Kind of held this off for last because you kind of have two real options here for Restoration Staff. You have the Master Restoration Staff, which comes from DSA, Dragonstar Arena from Fraglorn, that's base game. And you have the Asylum Restoration Staff, which comes from Asylum Sanctorium from the Clockwork City DLC, the new trial. So Master Restoration Staff, every time you use Healing Springs, it restores stamina to every friendly target affected. There is currently a bug where it's actually centered on you and not the Healing Spring, so it's only allies near you, not allies in your Healing Spring specifically, so do keep that in mind. But that's the reason why Master's Restoration Staff is so powerful, is because of that stamina return. It's just a very, very powerful group utility set because everybody uses stamina. Tanks use it to block. Healers, magicka DPS, you use it to block a cast, you use it to dodge roll out of things, you use it to break free out of CC. Stamina DPS, obviously you use stamina to deal DPS. So that's why the Master's Restoration Staff is the go-to for healers. Um, for the Asylum's Restoration Staff, whenever you cast Blessing of Protection, in other words, Combat Prayer, that reduces the cost of your magic and stamina healing abilities by 27% for 3 seconds for the imperfect. The perfect staff reduces it by 30%. This is more selfish. It does reduce the cost. It helps out your sustain, but at the same time, you're losing out on group benefit there. There are some situations in some trials where you're going to be using Purge, which is an expensive skill that is affected by Timeless Blessing. So that's kind of where the Asylum Restoration Staff kind of shines, but it just doesn't provide as much group utility as the Master's Restoration Staff. Now for our Lightning Staff, we're using Maelstrom. Realistically, you can use any Lightning Staff, but Maelstrom is probably going to be the most useful out of the unique Lightning Staff weapons. It's going to be more useful than the Masters, and it's going to be more useful than the Asylum because you won't be using Force Pulse and you won't be using Destructive Clench as a healer. However, you will be using light attacks and you will be using heavy attacks as a healer, so that's kind of why we're going with the Maelstrom's Lightning Staff. It just helps provide just a little bit more DPS. It's not really going to add too much in terms of your DPS output. Besides, you aren't a DPS, your job is not to increase your own DPS. But every little bit helps, especially when you're going for those high-end leaderboard scores. So that's why the Maelstrom's Lightning Staff is the Lightning Staff of choice. Now, like I said before, if you are going with Master Architect, you can go with Decisive, but Infuse is going to be preferable. For your Lightning Staff, you can go with a Shock Damage enchant to help increase off-balance uptime. You can go with Absorb Magic if you're having sustain problems, or you can go with Weakening just to increase weakening uptime. But for your Restoration Staff, you're going to want to use a Weakening enchant. Just like Mending, this reduces the amount of damage coming in. The Infuse reduces by 452, which is very, very potent. And I believe the non-infused reduces by, I want to say, around 320, 330 golded out, so it's a very powerful damage reduction ability. So if it scales accordingly to, if it scales in line with Mending, then it pretty much acts as a second Mending set when it's infused, almost a full second Mending set when not infused. So you're basically reducing incoming damage by a significant portion, anywhere between, I believe it's 20 to 25% if you have a weakening and mending up on the boss at all times. So that's kind of it for gear. Like I said earlier, all the gear sets that I covered here is pretty much interchangeable between classes, regardless if you're Templar or a Sorc or a Dragonite healer. These sets are pretty much going to be your main options for endgame content healing. Again, there are a couple of exceptions. Some sets are more effective on certain classes than others. For example, Trinamax Valor for Dragon Knights, Master Architect for Wardens. But for the most part, these are going to be your options. So kind of a quick recap, you always want to have Spell Power Cure, and you always want it to be golded out, so you always want it to be on your body. Worm and Mending are going to be the top two choices after that, and then from there you have Twilight Remedy, Sanctuary, Master Architect, and Trinamax Valor. Master Architect being most effective on Warden healers, and Trinamax Valor really only being useful on Dragon Knight healers. So that covers it for part 1 of this healing guide. Part 2 will be coming out soon, probably in the next couple of days. I'm going to start initially with Templar healing because that's what I'm most familiar with, but I will go into Warden healing and eventually other classes as well. So be on the lookout for part 2, and then part 3 will be coming out shortly after part 2 is released. Probably going to be doing a Vet DLC dungeon. I don't really heal Vet Trials too much, but so you will get an idea of kind of what it looks like to heal in the endgame content. Vet DLC dungeons are particularly difficult, so that's kind of where a lot of people are going to start getting used to healing endgame style. So be on the lookout for part 3. It's probably going to come out a day or two after part 2 lands. So that's it for part 1 of the healing guide. Hope this guide helps, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.